History has this strange ability to cling to things, to people, to places, to objects you can actually touch. Sometimes a single name gets so big it turns into an entire era. You say Jacksonian or Victorian or Elizabethan, and even before you pin down the dates, you can feel the mood of that time, the arguments people were having, the rules they lived under, the kind of world they thought was normal. And it's not just people. Certain places hit you the same way. Jerusalem, Rome, Paris, Valley Forge, Stonehenge. Even if you couldn't give a quiz show summary of them, those names land with weight. If you've ever stood somewhere old, somewhere layered, you know the sensation I'm talking about. Not spooky, not ghosts, just that compression of time where your imagination starts doing the math. And suddenly the air feels thicker, because you can almost sense how much happened right where you're standing. Then there are objects, the Liberty Bell, the Book of Kells, the Declaration of Independence. They stop being simple items and turn into symbols, witnesses, in some cases, even drivers of history, because people rally around them, fight over them, protect them, steal them, die for them. So let me put a question on the table. What if the object is a document or a bell or a crown? What if it's furniture? And no, I don't mean the chair your family refuses to throw out. Not the end table that somehow survives every move like it's indestructible out of pure stubbornness. I mean a piece of furniture with a backstory so intense, so tangled up in world events, that it stops feeling like furniture at all. It becomes a character, a relic, a tool of diplomacy, a silent bystander that's been present in one form or another for survival, loss, political tension, and cautious respect between rival nations. Because today's story isn't really about a desk. It's about tragedy and endurance. It's about national pride and a kind of careful courtesy practice between countries that didn't fully trust each other. It's about war and trade disputes, ambition and fear, polar exploration and death. And yes, brushing right up against the edge of cannibalism. This is Insights into History, Season 1, Episode 3, The Resolute, Part 1. And this is the story behind the Resolute Desk. Here's the version most people know. The Resolute Desk is that famous wooden desk tied to American presidents, photographed in the White House, instantly recognizable in political images. It's big, it's imposing, and it's loaded with symbolism. Officially, it's a large double pedestal partner's desk made from the oak timbers of a British Arctic ship, HMS Resolute. And in 1880, Queen Victoria presented it as a gift to U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes. But that familiar, modern story, the one that lives in photographs and headlines, is basically the ending. It's the last page. The oak that became that desk had already lived another life first, and that earlier life was brutal, cold, and very nearly fatal. And wrapped around that earlier life is one of the great mysteries of the 19th century. Whatever happened to Sir John Franklin? Behind all of that, there's another layer people tend to forget. For much of the 1800s, Britain and the United States were not comfortable partners. They weren't the reliable allies we think of today. They were wary, competitive, and on more than one occasion, dangerously close to another major crisis. So if we want to understand how this desk came to exist, we need to go far away from the Oval Office. We need to begin where the story really starts. We need to begin in the ice. The 19th century was, in many ways, the peak era of Arctic exploration, at least for nations willing to gamble money, ships, and human lives for maps, prestige, and the possibility of a trade route that could change everything. For generations, European powers chased the Northwest Passage, a navigable sea route to the Canadian Arctic that could link the Atlantic and Pacific without forcing ships to grind their way around the southern tip of South America. If you could chart it, you could shorten voyages, move goods faster, expand influence, and claim bragging rights that would echo through newspapers and parliament halls. Britain, especially, poured resources into this obsession. Expedition after expedition pushed farther north, tracing coastlines, mapping channels, making educated guesses about what lay beyond the horizon. And eventually, one name fused to that dream so tightly that it became inseparable from it: Sir John Franklin. Franklin was born in 1786 in Lincolnshire, England. He entered the Navy young, and his career stretched across the British maritime world. He served in the era of the Napoleonic Wars, and as time went on, his reputation leaned more and more into exploration. But here's something important. Franklin wasn't simply the romantic idea of an explorer, the kind of figure you imagine holding a lantern against a snowy wind while dramatic music swells behind him. He was an explorer who had already witnessed the Arctic's worst instincts. Earlier in his career, Franklin took part in punishing overland expeditions, including the infamous Coppermine Journey, an ordeal that burned itself into public imagination. Men froze. They starved. They collapsed. Some didn't return. The Arctic made a point, over and over again, that courage doesn't guarantee survival. Those experiences gave Franklin a reputation that cut two ways. On one hand, he was proven, experienced, someone who had seen real hardship and still functioned as a leader. On the other hand, it painted him as stubborn, the kind of person who would keep pushing past warning signs because turning back felt like failure. Franklin's life beyond exploration carried a mix of honor and heartache. He was knighted. He held significant responsibilities. He served as lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, what we now call Tasmania. It was a major post, and it placed him far from the polar world. And yet, the North kept pulling at him. By the 1840s, the British Admiralty decided it was time for one more massive attempt, the kind of effort meant to finish the map and solve the problem once and for all. Find the route, lock down the knowledge, cement the legacy. Franklin was chosen to lead it. He was 59 years old, which made the decision controversial in some circles. Not everyone thought he should be the one, but he was also one of the most famous living symbols of Britain's polar ambition. And sometimes symbolism matters as much as strategy. He was given two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were reinforced for ice, heavily equipped, and loaded with supplies intended to stretch across years, not months. The plan demanded endurance. The Arctic doesn't care about schedules. In May of 1845, the expedition sailed. They moved north toward Greenland, then deeper into the polar world, where seasons set the rules and mistakes aren't gentle. After a final sighting by Europeans in July of 1845, Franklin and his men disappeared into the white silence. And when a major expedition vanishes, something else begins almost immediately. The search. Not just one search, but years of searching. Pressure from the public, anguish from families, political debate, newspaper obsession. The Franklin mystery became a fixation, and the hunt for answers began, sending ships into the Arctic again and again. Those efforts created ripples that stretched far beyond the ice fields. Ripples that would eventually touch a ship called Resolute. But before we reach that ship, we need to talk about another force that shapes this story, because it explains why what happens later matters so much. While Britain was trying to understand what happened to Franklin, Britain and the United States were also navigating a relationship that was anything but simple. The early to mid-1800s were not an era of relaxed friendship between the U.S. and Great Britain. The American Revolution wasn't ancient history. It was still close enough to feel personal in political culture. Then the War of 1812 tore open old wounds again. It ended with the Treaty of Ghent. And while the borders didn't radically change, the distrust didn't vanish either. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine made America's position clearer. The United States intended to push back against further European expansion in the Western Hemisphere. But Britain still had major colonial interests. The U.S. was growing in ambition and power. And those realities kept colliding in negotiations and trade, and in the ongoing question of who would shape North America's future. Even when bigger conflicts broke out elsewhere in the world, it didn't necessarily calm the situation. Sometimes it made everything more fragile. During the U.S. Civil War, for instance, the Trent Affair in 1861 brought the two countries alarmingly close to a serious diplomatic fallout. At the same time, political anger tied to Irish independence, especially among Irish Americans furious about British rule, poured more heat into an already tense atmosphere. Then, in the late 1860s, the creation of the Dominion of Canada changed Britain's posture in North America again, shifting how power, borders, and influence were managed. Beneath every headline and every negotiation sat the same heavy foundation: wealth, industry, shipping power, influence, and national pride, the kind that doesn't like to concede anything. By the middle of the century, leaders on both sides were staring at the same uncomfortable truth. If the United States and Great Britain kept treating each other as inevitable enemies, sooner or later they'd stumble into becoming exactly that. So here's the tension that makes this story more than just a tale about a ship or a desk. What could possibly soften that kind of rivalry? What kind of moment could shift a relationship hardened by war and suspicion into something closer to respect? The surprising answer begins in the Arctic, with a missing expedition and a desperate years-long search. It winds its way through ice and uncertainty, and it eventually ends in a room most people associate with warm lighting, press cameras, and executive power. It ends, strangely, as a desk, because the Resolute Desk isn't famous only because presidents have used it. It's famous because it's built from the remains of a vessel whose story sits right at the intersection of catastrophe and courtesy. A ship that, for a brief moment, nudged two wary rivals towards something rare in international politics, a sincere gesture of respect. To meet that ship, we have to head back into the ice one more time. And that's where we'll pick up in our next episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of Insights into History. If you have feedback, ideas, or a story you think deserves a deeper look, you can email me at comments@insightsintothings.com. That's comments@insightsintothings.com. Or you can call and leave a voice message at 856-403-8788. Again, that number is 856-403-8788. Leave a message, and if you'd like, we may include it in a future episode. Join me next week for the Resolute Part 2, where we continue the journey and bring this story to its conclusion.